there's that is certainly an issue, but you know, the batteries are still somewhat large. We always tell every surgeon's telling the manufacturer make something smaller. The good news in this is that there are other companies getting into this field, and there will be more competition in the United States to try to get the system to be more cosmetic. But it's not terrible for most people. I'm going to talk now about the studies, and a lot of data is going to flow by, and I'm happy to come back to these later or answer questions by email about these studies. The studies for generalized dystonia rely on what's called the Burke-Van Marsden Dystonia Rating Scale, and this is, as I say, for generalized dystonia. And essentially on all of these scales, a higher score is worse. So that's kind of the thing. So this is a scale used to rate the severity of dystonia in a variety of different body regions. And there's subscales for movement and for overall disability. And again, higher is worse. The other scale, as was mentioned by my colleague who preceded me here, is called the Twister Scale, which extends for Toronto Western Spasmodic Torticollis Rating Scale. Of course, this is specific for cervical dystonia and is very relevant to what we're talking about today. And in this scale consists of three subsections: the severity, the disability, and the pain. And again, higher is worse. So when we're looking at the outcome of these DBS studies, we want to see the either percent reduction or the overall reduction in number on these scales. So I'm going to summarize everything first, just to give the main point, and then we'll come back to some individual studies, and then, let's see, when should I finish my talk? 5 to 10 minutes, excellent. So, the bottom line is that bilateral globus pallidus DBS leads to about a 50 to 60% improvement on the Burke-Van Marsden Dystonia Rating Scale. These are for the generalized dystonia patients. And that's where this field started. And there's two New England Journal of Medicine level class 1 studies, meaning randomized studies, supporting the benefit of DBS, and I'll go over those briefly. DBS is FDA approved for dystonia under what's called a humanitarian device exemption. And I'll come back to the subtypes of dystonia and specifically cervical dystonia, which is important to us here today. I'm going to skip that study in the interest of time. So the first sort of high profile, I would say, study, it's in the New England Journal of Medicine, was this study. And I know you can't read any of that, so I'll just summarize it here. This is a French study, and what's interesting is the two big studies that came out on this were both from Europe in 2005 and 2006. So this is the 2005 study, and it's a multi-center French study of 22 patients. One of the things that is also very interesting about this field is that these studies are of not a huge number of patients, but despite that, remarkable improvements were seen. So the statistics of doing something on 22 patients and finding a 50% improvement is quite impressive, and I just want to put that out there. We can discuss that. But basically, these were all patients with generalized dystonia, so this is not relevant to cervical dystonia. The BFM-DRS, that scale, was assessed before surgery and at these time points after. And suffice it to say that, as I mentioned, things got better over time. And by 12 months, the dystonia movement score and the disability score, which are those subscales of BFM-DRS, improved approximately in half. So it was cut from 46 to 21, in this case 11 to 6. So both the quality of movement and the disability level improved at 12 months after surgery. One drawback of this study is that it didn't have what we call a sham stimulation control group. So to be perfectly scientific about this, you want to implant electrodes into a group of patients, turn some people on, and have other people think that they're on, but not be on. And that's the second study did that. That's the tricky way to make sure that there's no placebo effects, or to try to make sure there's no placebo effects. It doesn't necessarily get rid of placebo effects, as we can discuss, because people often will know when the stimulation is on. This particular group, this particular French group, later published a follow-up from the same group of patients, which was a longer follow-up. As I said here, this is a 1-year study, so the question is, does it last more than 1 year? Does it get better? Do the effects stay the same or improve? And what's interesting is that the improvement seen at 1 year, which was 51% improvement on that scale, was maintained at 3 years and slightly increased, so 58% improvement. So that was very encouraging. This was published in 2007. And the improved quality of life was similar to that was observed at 1 year. There were a few patients that had that were terminated because of technical dysfunction or infection, and that's true in all of these types of studies. And this just graphically shows the overall disability and movement scores at the beginning, and then after 1 year, and after 3 years. So the benefits were maintained at 3 years in this study. I want to come to the second major study that I mentioned, which is also a European study. This was published in 2006, and this was a multi-center study from Germany, Austria, and Norway. It had more patients, 40, than 22, the other study. And the other interesting part of this study was that it didn't only include the primary generalized dystonia patients, it also included patients with segmental dystonia, which would be like torticollis patients. And again, they were evaluated with the BFM-DRS scale and evaluated. Now, in this study, what they did very interestingly was they switched the same patients over from stimulation, from sham stimulation to stimulation, etc. So they were evaluating the same patient whether they were on or off stimulation. And the bottom line is that patients did much better on stimulation. This just gives you kind of a graphical picture of that. So if they were started on stimulation, then they immediately improved and maintained the improvement, meaning the movement score got better. If they started with sham stimulation over the first 3 months, then these are individual patients. Their movement score didn't change, and then once stimulation started at month 3, then patients got better. So one of the issues in these studies is each patient is very different from the next patient, and their type of dystonia may be different. There's a heterogeneous population of patients. But overall, statistically, everybody did better with stimulation. And like the French study, this group also published what's called a health-related quality of life study, which is, the bottom line is, it's not whether you get better on a movement scale, it's is your life better? And that's really important. So they use these forms called short form 36, which measures things like physical functions, limitations, body pain, general health, vitality, social function. So more important social variables than just, am I better in the neurologist's office on some scale? And the interesting part is that all of these domains, all of the domains, so-called, these subcategories of the short form 36, improved with stimulation but did not improve with sham stimulation. And I take that to be actually a very important result, because it's basically not just that your motor function objectively improved in the office by 50%, whatever that means, but it's also that your life has gotten better. I became involved in this at UC San Francisco, and there were a few patients early on that were treated for cervical dystonia, and at that time, which was back in 2006, it's not that long ago, it was not even clear, even at that time, how to program these patients compared to the patients with generalized dystonia. So placing the electrode in the target is technically doable, and that was fine in 2006. But what I want to just communicate, the one thing that's evolved over the past 5 years is how to program these patients. And that's really expertise of the neurologists involved. So 50% improvement in dystonia severity and disability. And studies may not have a lot of statistical power, but are already statistically significant even despite low patient numbers. I'm going to skip the long-term follow-up just to state that there's actually studies out now with individual patients out to 8 years and 10 years in a few patients. Now, not that many patients have been studied that long with dystonia, but there are a few studies out. I want to just spend the last couple minutes on cervical dystonia, because that's, of course, why we're here today, but that preceding information was really what led up to studies specifically of cervical dystonia. This is all in the past really 5 years or so.